Ever felt like a simple piece of paper could control your whole life? Or that fear could stick around so long it starts to feel like a part of you? In this video, I'm diving into two stories. One about a chain letter that haunted a kid for days, and another about a child sleeping in a room right next to the dead. These are the fears we all thought we left behind, but trust me, they stick with you in ways you'd never expect. Before we dive into these stories, make sure to hit that like button if you love a good scare. Subscribe to the channel for more spine-chilling content, and share this video with your friends who are horror fans. Ready? Let's jump into two unforgettable tales that just might keep you up at night. This isn't just another spooky story. This is my real-life nightmare from 1950 in Saint Martinville, Louisiana. A place where old traditions and beliefs weren't just stories, they were life. I was just 10 years old when my grandpa died on this super sticky August night, sitting in his beat-up old armchair. And here's the wild part. Back then, families would keep the body in the living room for 3 days so relatives could pay their respects. Picture this. My grandpa lying in an open coffin, covered with a white cloth, under this flickering kerosene lamp light. A room that was always warm and full of life, suddenly felt cold, alien, creepy. That first night, I was in the bedroom across from the living room. Everyone else was whispering prayers, but I was dying inside. The doors were closed, but this heavy, unbearable silence, it felt like it was breaking through the walls. I stared at the ceiling, tracking these thin cracks that looked like tiny veins. Every time I closed my eyes, images would swarm my mind. What if Grandpa wasn't really gone? What if he woke up? Even now, writing this, my palms go cold just thinking about those nights. At one point, I heard this super soft rustle, barely a sound, like a breeze caressing curtains. But the curtains? Completely still. My heart was beating so loud I was sure they could hear it in the next room. My thoughts went wild and ruthless. What if his body wasn't just a body? What if his spirit was wandering, trapped between this world and the next? I imagined his cold, stiff hands lifting the coffin lid, his face illuminated by the lamp, turning towards me. I couldn't look away from the door, those open doors that felt like an invitation. Every creaky wooden floor sound felt like a footstep. There were moments I was convinced some shadowy figure was standing in my doorway, motionless and silent. Was it my eyes, tricked by fear? Or was something really waiting in the darkness? The blanket pulled over my head didn't help at all. The silence was threatening, almost tangible. Each clock tick felt like a countdown to something inevitable. That first night, I didn't dare close my eyes. Every time I'd dare, I'd imagine Grandpa's body moving, rising, walking quietly towards me. Would his steps be heavy or light? Would he smile, or would his lips remain motionless? But his eyes? What if his eyes weren't his anymore? These questions swirled in my mind, creating a vortex I couldn't escape. That night, I learned what true fear means. The second night, even worse. The first night brought the fear of the unknown, but this? Pure psychological agony. The room where I was lying seemed darker, like every single ray of light had decided to nope out of this place. When I tried to fall asleep, I felt the air around me changing, getting heavier. The house sounds intensified. Every creak, every distant noise was now unbearably loud. Somewhere close to midnight, I swear I heard a voice. Soft, raspy, barely comprehensible, but sounding like it came directly from the living room. More of a whisper than words, but it left a deep mark in my mind. Was it my grandpa, or something else? I moved in bed, and the floorboard beneath me creaked. But this time, the creak didn't sound like just wood. It felt like something was responding to my movement. I lay completely still, every muscle tensed, cold sweat sliding down my back. My imagination was working overtime. I saw Grandpa rising from the coffin, the flickering lamplight revealing him as he moved towards the door. His hands now long and bony, moving in unnatural motions, calling me with a voice that wasn't his anymore. The feeling of not being alone in that room was so intense that at one point, I sat up in bed. My heart was racing like it might burst through my chest, my breath shallow and interrupted. I looked towards the door. They remained slightly open, like a passage to something that didn't belong in this world. Outside, the wind was howling, leaves hitting the window glass. But inside, the silence was heavier than any sound. I couldn't take it anymore. At one moment, the unbearable tension forced me to get up. Barefoot, I crossed the cold floor, each step feeling like an eternity. When I reached my room's threshold, I couldn't force myself to take another step. I stood there, trembling, staring into the darkness of the living room. And then, through the flickering lamplight, I swore I saw a shadow move. The room across from me looked darker than ever before. The kerosene lamp was burning weaker, or at least that's how it seemed to me. Its crazy flickering light was creating these long, unstable shadows that were seriously dancing on the walls. Every single time I looked towards those doors, I got this intense feeling that something was moving behind them. But if I stared too long, my heart would jump, like I was 100% about to see Grandpa rising from his motionless sleep. And trust me, that was not something I wanted to see. The sounds of the house? Totally different now. Wooden boards were creaking so loud. It was like something heavy was straight up walking across them. Sometimes I'd hear this deep wind sigh through window cracks, but in this insane silence, the wind sounded like this long, heavy exhale, almost like a whisper from the dead. I started feeling this crazy coldness sneaking into the room, even though the air had been thick and hot just hours before. And I kept wondering, was this coldness coming from something supernatural? That night, sleeping wasn't even an option. I lay there curled under my blanket, fighting every single muscle twitch that wanted to look towards those doors. My brain was going into overdrive. What if Grandpa's face suddenly appeared in that creepy flickering light? What if his empty eyes were staring directly at me? These thoughts were like poison, spreading through my mind and choking out every single rational thought. Just before dawn, when the first light started breaking through the darkness, the tension hit its peak. At one moment, I swear on everything I heard this soft sound, like wood cracking. My heart completely stopped. I didn't even dare to breathe. I just lay there, eyes closed, praying morning would hurry up and save me. That morning, the coffin was closed, and Grandpa's body was taken away. The house became brighter again, but not for me. The fear of that night had left marks in me that years couldn't erase. Even now, I feel the chill climbing up my spine. I imagine again those shadows on the walls, the noises in the night, and the cold sensation of a presence that should never have been there. Every time I feel a breeze coming through the window, I return to that room, to those 3 nights that shaped my fear of the unknown. This is a story of deeply rooted fear, a fear that never completely disappears. The night was heavy and suffocating, like the air had literally glued itself to everything around me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at this totally sketchy piece of paper. Found it earlier that afternoon in the mailbox, inside this old brown envelope with no stamp. My name was written on it, in this handwriting that looked like a kid had scribbled it or someone was in a major rush. The writing was messy, but the message? Crystal freaking clear. The paper was packed with horror stories about people who'd gone through nightmare scenarios. A guy who fell off a roof, a woman whose house burned down, some rich dude who got sick and died in total agony. All because they didn't forward this cursed letter to 8 other addresses. My hands were shaking while reading the final lines. If you don't send this letter to 8 addresses, terrible things will happen to you. This is not a joke. Your fate depends on you. I was only 8, but something in that letter awakened a fear I couldn't even explain. My heart was racing like it was trying to escape my chest. I kept imagining all the horrific things that could happen if I didn't comply. I was dying inside, terrified something might happen to my mom, dad. How could I know if what was written was real? What if something actually terrible happened? I was too young to understand logic, but old enough to feel the horrifying weight of this threat. I didn't even know how to find 8 addresses, let alone who I could involve. What if I failed? I was trembling sitting at that table. Nobody could imagine how terrifying it was to be a kid with such a burden. Every time I tried to let go of the letter, it felt like something awful would happen immediately. My fear was real, like a shadow that just wouldn't leave me alone. I finally folded the letter and hid it under my pillow. The thought of sending it to 8 addresses was way too much for me. I had no clue how I'd do it, and I definitely didn't want anyone to know. What would my parents say? Or my teacher? They'd think I was crazy, right? The first night after deciding not to send the letter? Absolute nightmare. I lay in the darkness, watching shadows on the walls and listening to a silence that was louder than anything I'd ever heard. Each heartbeat echoed in my head. Would something happen right now? Or tomorrow? The next day passed without incident, but that did nothing to reduce my fear. At school, I could barely follow what the teacher was saying. My friends were talking during break, but I could hardly hear their voices. My mind was filled with horrific images of what might happen. Would something collapse on me? Or would something terrible happen to my family? Day by day, the fear just kept growing, like some creepy shadow I couldn't shake. I started dodging all the places I used to love. The tree I'd climb all the time. My bike that I rode like a total boss down the street. I was convinced something awful would go down if I dared to go near them. And nights? Oh, nights were a whole new level of nope. I'd wake up in a sweat, feeling like something was watching me. But the freakiest part? It wasn't even there. It was just my own messed up imagination. So, 7 days of this pure anxiety fest went by. Nothing actually happened, but my brain wouldn't chill. What if they were just waiting for the perfect moment? What if, when I least expected it, bam, nightmare mode activated? And that stupid letter under my pillow? It felt like it weighed a ton. Every time I thought, okay, I'm tossing this thing, something inside me went, what if you need it, though? What even? Looking back now, it feels kinda unreal. I mean, I was literally counting days like I was in a horror movie. 7 days, then 8, then 10. And guess what? Nothing happened. Slowly, the fear started losing its grip. That letter under my pillow? It was just some crumpled up trash at that point. One day, I pulled it out, ripped it to shreds, and tossed it like the garbage it was. But the fear? That didn't just poof away. It lingered. Even when I knew nothing was wrong, I'd still get random heart-pounding moments, like, what if? Fast forward a few years, and I realized just how real all of that was to my tiny, 8-year-old self. Now, 40 years later, yeah, 40, I laugh about how that stupid letter had me so freaked out. But it's not all funny. There's this little pang of sadness too. Sadness for that scared kid who had no one to talk to, who was carrying around all this heavy, grown-up fear like a backpack full of bricks. And you know what? I wonder, if a kid today got a chain letter, would they even care? Would they just meme it, or would their parents step in like, this is dumb, ignore it? Or maybe they would care. The world's changed, but kids? They're still kids. I really hope no one would have to deal with that kind of fear alone. I hope someone would notice and say, hey, it's okay. And if I ever meet a kid like that, you better believe I'm telling them my story. The one about a letter I never sent and fears that eventually disappeared.